Thank you very much for joining us today. This is our opportunity to hear from some of the guys who were intimately involved with the Cobra, and most importantly, we get to find out whether they are as brutish as the cars they drove. This is their opportunity to prove or disprove that. So many of them who worked for Shelby wore many hats. They weren't just drivers, they were managers, they were designers, they were floor sweepers. You know, they did all sorts of different things with a small operation on a budget with big ambition. Before we start, I'd like to take a moment to remember Jerry Grant. May we have the Jerry Grant slide, the very first one, please? He was going to be part of this seminar. He agreed early on, but we lost him this past Sunday. And he was part of the Shelby American team. He went on to run Indy cars, and we've lost him, and it underscores how important it is that we have these people with us today, because we've already lost a lot of important people. Long ago we lost Ken Miles, we lost Davey McDonald, Phil Hill, others. So we need to celebrate the ones we have here. Please join me in welcoming Lou Spencer, John Morton, Alan Grant, and Peter Brock. Lou here had another career before he, I guess it was in the kitchen cabinet business? The kitchen business, and then he went on to race and sell Morgans and I guess AC, and then he became part of Shelby American as a driver and in a management position. John Morton really wanted to race. He moved from Illinois to California to enroll in Shelby's school, and he never left. He started on the shop floor for Shelby, and he would do anything to learn and drive, and he made his way on the team, and well, he's still racing today, so he's a legend. Alan Grant has been successful in construction and real estate, but in the early 60s he wanted to race, and he wanted to race for Shelby. And when a factory drive didn't come about, he took a job as a welder, and he found a way to get in a privately owned Cobra and proved that he was worthy of a spot on the team, and so he's become part of the legend now. And then nobody probably wore more hats than Peter Brock. He ran the racing school. He mounted tires for the tire distributorship. He designed the very car that allowed Shelby to win the FIA GT World Championship, the Daytona Coupe. And he went on to be known for the BRE Datsun racing team and photojournalist. So we have a bunch of very, very talented people, and we are so lucky to have them here today. Let's start with Lou. Lou, you wore several hats at Shelby American during the Cobra era. Please tell us about a couple of the responsibilities that you had besides driving, and in addition, and about the driving. How did you come to be there?
Carol asked me.
That's a good start.
Did quite a few things there. Not really sure how I got selected to get on the team. I don't think any of us really know. It just happened. As Al Dowd one day asked if I'd come out, and needless to say, I did. I don't think anybody ever turned down Shelby. They were crazy.
Lou's being too modest. He's probably one of the greatest Morgan racers that was out there, and had a great name in Southern California racing. And Carol. What's that? Oh, okay. Does that work now?
No.
We'll have to talk to it. Now is it working? Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I was going to say Lou has been way too modest on that. He was really one of the top drivers in Southern California, and Morgans and Bristols and stuff, and Carol had a lot of respect for him. So it's not that he didn't know how he got chosen. He was certainly one of the guys that would have been under a great group of guys that we had in Southern California, like Dan and Skip and Phil, of course. And so having Lou in the team was really an advantage, and of course his managerial skills came at the end there. So now you can go and tell him.
I see how much I had to pay him. Got to do all sorts of fun things there. Of course, driving was the best of them. Ended up working directly for Carol. Did that for about, heavens, I don't know how many years. Many years. Enjoyed it most of the time. Never a dull moment. It just, times just rolled. Racing, of course, was the most exciting part of it. The thing we all wanted to do, but you couldn't race forever. I think that working for Shelby...
Hold on a second. John's still racing.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's John. I mean, it's not John Morton, it's John Immortal.
No, I started really young. These guys are much older than I am. Except for Alan.
What color's your hair? Shelby was really something different. Many of the stories that went on, we couldn't even tell. Some of them I don't even tell to myself anymore. But I said a couple of times, never a dull moment. Something was always happening, something was always coming up, something was new, something was different. I remember once that Al Dowd made the comment that I think the old man's going to outlive all of us. And all I can say, I'm glad he didn't make it past all of us.
We were wondering whether we would make it or not.
Yeah. I didn't think that he was ever going to go.
Well,
I gotta throw in my 2 bits about Lou Spencer. As you can tell, Lou is a very gracious man. He's soft-spoken. He's just a real gentleman. But put him in a race car, and Katie barred the door. I raced against Lou, you know, against his Morgan and Cobras and the whole works. And look out when Lou's behind the wheel.
The only time I beat him, his wheel fell off in front of me. He was in front of me, but his wheel fell off.
and were you the one who loosened the knockoff?
Yeah.
Were you the one who loosened the knockoff?
No, actually, it was a Morgan that spindle broke.
It had to be a Morgan, the spindle broke.
Yeah, it's a wooden spindle, wasn't it? Yeah.
No, they weren't wooden. They were brittle, I think.
Well, please go on.
Somebody should have told Morgan how to make spindles, I guess.
Yeah.
That was really one of their biggest faults.
Was it? Yeah.
Very common. Happened more than once.
Cobra had that problem at first too, but Phil Remington fixed it in a hurry.
Yes.
Yeah, Morgan didn't have Phil Remington.
Yeah.
But that's somebody to talk about, isn't it? Absolute master of anything that could be done.
Yeah, if we had Phil Remington here, he's in the hospital, but he is really the living legend of motorsports. I mean, he was at the very beginning of the whole sports car movement in the United States, and right to the end, he worked for Dan, right up building the Delta wing that went to Le Mans this year. So he's seen it all, and I really wish he could have made it up here. We were hoping he could have, but Phil Remington was the master fabricator and the guy that really glued all the Cobras together and made Shelby American what it was.
So, in your opinions, collectively, he was probably one of the most critical components
Absolutely.
in getting to the championship?
Absolutely.
Very much so.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
A little story about Phil, a recent story. He's 91 years old, and Scott George from the Collier Museum was interviewing him at lunch. And Phil said, "You're going to have to make it fast. I only get an hour for lunch."
Is there someone else that you would think was almost as critical to the success of the program as Phil Remington? Another person who stands out, maybe even one of you, for example.
I think Peter.
No,
More than
it would be Joan Cole. It was
I
Carol's.
agree, Joan.
Joan, yeah.
That's true.
That was Carol's girlfriend that started the whole company and
I mean, he wasn't
organized
married
it.
to her?
Ah, I don't
Oh,
think
I'm
so.
shocked.
No, she was Mrs. They told the young guys she was Mrs. Shelby, but I went over to their apartment once and to put the door back on the hinges that Carol had torn off when she locked him out. But they weren't exactly Mrs. But things were different back then.
Yeah.
Well,
People were very prudish.
Yeah.
Well, you just brought up an important point, John, that you did lots of things. Now, you didn't start by putting doors back on the hinges. You started on the shop floor. What was that capacity? That
Well,
you started at?
it's commonly called a janitor, I guess, but actually what happened was I was the, you know, they didn't, Remington used to call me the janitor with a Jag because I had an old Jaguar. But I got moved up to parts chaser because the parts chaser was a guy named Joe Washington, and he would drink on the job, and he called it cough syrup, but everybody knew it wasn't. And they were afraid he'd have an accident, so they made me the parts chaser and Joe the janitor.
And by the way, John and I roomed together in a converted garage, and he had this Jaguar, and I had a '54 Chevy two-door, and we'd start out, and we'd race to work, and it just all depended who got into the coming down Carter Street, who got to the Princeton turn first.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that. Al Dowd and I used to race down the Santa Monica Freeway to see who got down to Long Beach. So I guess we did that all over the place.
Yeah. Earl Jones and I used to race home from the airport every day because we lived in the same fourplex. And the old airport, the road behind the airport before they extended the LAX runways was a pretty curvy road. So we'd race there every night.
Now,
That whole area of Marina del Rey where our shop was in Venice at that time was all open. I mean, today it's absolutely solid apartments in Marina and it's just high end, but at that time there was just one great big long sweeping road out there, and it was the one place we could just take off right out of the shop, go back there and blast down that road. You could just go flat out, and it's just to imagine today that we were running those speeds on that road just a block away from the shop. It's just amazing.
There weren't many cops out there either.
No, there was a great testing place.
Now, Alan, when you first showed up at Shelby American, you'd been pretty successful already, and you wanted to race for them. And like a lot of other people, you started in another capacity. You were hired not as a driver, but as a welder. Why don't you tell the folks how you managed to wangle yourself your first drive in a Cobra by parlaying your position?
His welding was so bad they had to find another job for him. Gotcha.
Hey, Lou, and I said nice things about you. Now I'm going to tell the truth.
So how did you get from welder to privateer driver to team driver?
All right, I had raced in AC Bristol when I turned 21. In those days, you had to be 21, and I won my championship, and then went back to college. And then during semester break, I'd been reading about Carroll Shelby, in Competition Press, which is now Auto Week, and that he was going to put a small block Ford in the AC chassis. And of course, I knew it inside and out. So during semester break, I went down and met Carroll and offered him my services. I thought he needed the best driver in the world, and so he said, well, he says, I've got Phil Hill and Dan Gurney, and Bonrant wasn't around yet, and Davey McDonald, and he says, but we're looking for welders. It was just, fortunately, I'd worked in a welding shop for a couple of years during summer vacation, and so Phil Remington hired me, and so I was on the production line welding sway bar brackets, on the frames of the 289s at that time. Later on, obviously, we had brackets put on all the cars as they were built. But after hours, I'd go over to the race car shop, and I'd work for 2 or 3, 4 hours, for nothing. And Phil Remington and I became very, very good friends. And so he knew I wanted to be in the race car shop, so I was transferred over there. Then they found out I had a couple years of college, and so they moved me upstairs, and I had a title of production control manager. Peter and I shared an office right next to Carroll Shelby's, and that was an interesting experience because we didn't keep the doors closed, and we could hear everything going on and what Carroll was saying, and you could tell whether he was in a good mood, in a bad mood, or whether he was happy or whether he was mad. There was no doubt whatsoever. So anyhow, part of my job was to order cars from AC and then also to sell cars to the dealers. Coventry Motors was our biggest dealer in Walnut Creek, and so somebody had talked them into buying a race car. So Jay Brown, the owner, called up and he says, hey, he says, we want to buy a race car. And I said, well, I just got one reconditioned factory car, and I'll sell it to you under one condition. And they said, well, what's that? And I says, I drive it. It got real quiet at the other end of the phone. Then he made the fatal mistake. He says, have you ever driven before? Did I give him a load about every race I won and how I won it and the whole works? And so I ended up, and I said, furthermore, I says, you need to put up an extra $1,000 because Ole Olson, who was our chief engine builder at the time, and I had become very, very good friends, and he had some things he wanted to do to get a little more horsepower. And so anyhow, they ended up fronting the money, and then I called my good friend George Lucas, who had went to every race with me in the AC Bristol, and he got in his Corvair and came down, and we got our heads together, and we said, hey, we need to get a car that will really stand out in the field. And at the time, the factory cars were black or dark blue, and the wheels were anodized, but they weren't polished out. And so anyhow, we came up with this yellow car, not just any yellow, DuPont tinting yellow, the yellowest yellow you can possibly get. Then instead of, to make the car further stand out, we put the stripes, instead of going front to back, we went over the top, back at an angle. And so consequently, the car, Friedman refers to it as the prettiest race car, Cobra, ever made, which I totally agree. So anyhow, I think
Yeah, well, exactly. Well, now to Peter. We know a lot about what Peter has done. An example of his work is in the back, his modern Cobra Coupe. But you had some design education. You'd done some work at GM. You'd been running the driving school, mounting tires. Wasn't a big leap to designing an entire car with clear aerodynamic goals? How'd you get there?
Well, the main thing is they didn't have the money to hire a real designer, so it was it was just plain luck that Carroll wanted to go to Europe, and obviously we didn't have the top speed with the Roadster. It wasn't fast enough, and I had found some papers that were written in the late 30s by the Germans on aerodynamic studies, and thought that that might be the way that we could get some extra speed out of the car. And so I didn't so much design the car as let the car design itself, knowing what the lines had to be according to what the Germans had laid out. And it was interesting, and normally when I worked at GM, I would do all these beautiful renderings and everything and try to sell an idea of what I thought the car should look like. And the Daytona really designed itself in its function. So we took these lines that the Germans had laid out, and just put them down over the chassis, and it pretty much designed itself. And then I put in a few aesthetic things about trying to make the thing, because it was such a strange looking car at that time that actually very few guys in the shop really wanted to work on it. They thought it was a very weird looking car and it wouldn't work, and the fact that we were going to add extra weight to it would make it slower, whatever. But I think the real thing that made the chassis or the car work was the chassis, that we stiffened the chassis up, and that made it very good on the short courses. And then the shape really improved the top end, so we were able to go from about 165 mile an hour with the Roadster's top speed up to about 185.
Thank you. Lou, that was it an easier or harder car to drive than the Roadster? You had experience in both, a lot of it.
I don't think there was that much difference other than heat. And the fellow that designed the car somewhere or other forgot to put in the air conditioning unit, and you sat in there and you sweltered. And of course, as the old story goes, I passed out in the car at Sebring. And some years, I made it back into the pits, and some years later I ran into the bloke and made a comment about, driving in, and he told me that I was unconscious when I got there. I thought I jumped out and jumped over the wall, and he said, no, we picked you up and we put you over the wall. But wish you would have done better than that.
Yeah.
It's too bloomin' hot.
You think about ideas of how to make things better, and one of the ideas was to make the tunnel down there for the transmission an area to transfer all that heat out the back of the car. And of course, what it did with all aluminum in there, it just went in there and just radiated out into the cockpit. And that was a real learning experience for me, because after that, I've really taken a lot more time to figure out what goes on internally in the car and try to make the cars more comfortable. And that was a lot of the things that we made the improvement on the new version back there.
So, Peter, what you're telling us is something we discussed at breakfast this morning, that the aero and the top speed was a higher priority to Carroll Shelby than driver comfort?
Absolutely. I think so. Yeah. He said, we got plenty of drivers.
Expendable. Well, from what I understand, they take drivers from almost anywhere. I understand that there was a guy sweeping floors who got a ride at Sebring. Tell us how that came about, John.
Well, I don't want to take too much time, but it came about because two people wanted to go to Sebring, and we weren't good enough to go as team members. So we lobbied really hard to get to go, and finally they called us up to the office and said, "We'll give you $25 a piece if you'll drive your own cars to Sebring and back. But you have to work off the money by being night watchman at the racetrack." So we said, "Okay, that sounds like a pretty good deal." So Jeffrey Schoolfield and I, we got a third guy, a guy named John Coupe. He had a Carmen Ghia because our cars wouldn't have made it. And so the three of us went to Sebring in a Carmen Ghia. And
No.
Coupe was kind of heavy set, and in the back of a Carmen Ghia won't take a heavy set person, so he had to ride in the passenger seat. And he also had another problem. He fell asleep at the wheel every time we let him drive, so he never could drive. We got there, and I ran into Lou and Ken. Lou won't remember this, but you'll remember that they had the tech in town on the square, and we had just gotten there after a 54-hour nonstop drive. And I got up early. We had a couple hours sleep, and because I wanted to see tech, and I'm watching the cars being teched, and Ken Miles and Lou walked up, and Ken said, "Do you have an FIA license?" And I said, "No." "Why?" And I said, "I don't." He said, "Because we only have 9 drivers, and we have 5 cars, and we might need you to drive with me in the 427. And I said, "I don't even have a logbook." I had one, but I lost it. And he said, "Can you get an FIA license?" I said, "I don't see how." So he pulled a piece of paper out. I'd give $1,000 for that paper now. He wrote, "John Morton is qualified for an FIA license." Ken Miles said, "Take this to race headquarters, see if they'll give you a license."
And you ended up driving in the race, correct?
Well, they gave me a license, and then Ken ran into a tree in practice and cracked some ribs, and the car was, for all practical purposes, destroyed, but they fixed it. We worked late at night and fixed the car. So 2 days later it did run, and poor Ken's driving around with cracked ribs with nobody to relieve him. So Shelby, in desperation, asked me if I knew the track, and I said, "Yeah, I know it." And he said, "When Ken comes in, you drive for him, okay?" And I said, "Yeah, it's fine." And I was so scared. I mean, I was scared to death because I'd never been on the track or in or in that car. So he came in, and I drove it until basically that evening when it blew up. Yeah.
But there's even a better part of the story. John got in the car, and they flag him out on the track, and there's no other cars in front of him, and he's never seen the track. He got out on those big runways out there, Sebring, and got lost.
Well, I spun twice on my out lap, but nobody expected much of the janitors, so they didn't even notice that it was a long lap.
John, do I remember properly, at some stage, was it Shelby gave you a hammer and something had happened to one of the cars out on the track and he was afraid they'd disqualify it, and he told you to get out there and bang on the car? Was that you?
I don't think it was me. I don't remember that.
It happened.
He told me, they did tell me when the car blew up, that said if the car breaks down, stay with it.
Yeah.
Which didn't make any sense at all because it's not going to finish the race. And so I'm, obedient. I sat there with the car for probably an hour and a half, and then I saw this huge glow in the sky about 45 minutes before the end of the race, and I thought, ooh, something big happened. And I left the car and went to the pits, and it was when Bob Johnson ran into the back of the Alpha, and Johnson and Gurney were leading the race, leading the GT class, and Bob ran into the back of an Alpha that didn't have any taillights on, and the Alpha driver was hurt badly. The Cobra was totally destroyed, and Bob, I think he just got a black eye and a broken nose, but that made me leave my post.
Tell us also about, as soon as you learned the track, you started going a lot quicker, and you were going back down into, I think, turn 16 before the final bridge, and he gets on the brakes, and then what happened?
Well, I guess most of you people know about Cobras because you wouldn't be here. The brakes failed, and but it had a lot of runoff, so I was able to come into the pits because that just precedes the pits, that turn. And I said the brakes failed, and they didn't really believe me because it was like the second or third lap I'd been out. So they worked on it, they banged on it a little bit, and I said try it now, and I went out again and did the same thing. And so I said, ask Ken, can you take it out because they aren't going to believe me, and see what you think. And so he took it out, went out, and came right back. Said the brakes don't work. So then they believed it, and they started searching what happened. The pin that holds the brake pedal had slid. There's holds the brake and the clutch. It's a piece of tubing. I don't know how, to 3/4 inch, whatever. And it had slid out far enough that the brake pedal was no longer pivoted. So they fixed that and then continued to drive it.
Speaking of first team drives, Alan, will you tell us about the first time you raced against the team? You had a little bit of excitement pretty early on in the race, didn't you?
I sure did. It's, again, this new engine that I wanted Coventry to build. We were late getting it in, and so I'd never raced at Riverside before, and we got out, and I did maybe half dozen laps, and the engine got warmed up, and all of a sudden the radiator hose popped off. Didn't hurt the engine at all. So I shut it off right away, but I didn't know the track that well, so I had qualified, I think, fourth behind Gurney, Bondurant, Lou, and then Richie Ginther was next to me. And so, but anyhow, Lucas and I got together and we said we got to get a good start because and try to get up behind Gurney, and I can learn the track from Gurney because nobody knows the track at Riverside better than Gurney. And so anyhow, Gurney got a good start. I got a good start, and so we got up going into turn 6. I was right on Gurney's tail, and Dave Friedman did an incredible job of a whole series of prints that are in some of his books. But anyhow, being inexperienced, I should have been protecting my line, but instead I was on the proper line because I was following Gurney. Well, Bondurant, being astute, he stuck his nose in there, and as I came across, we touched and spun me out, and I had to wait for all 30 cars to go by, and my dreams had just gone up in smoke. I'd been a little vocal about, what I was going to do to the factory team. In fact, they used to call me Cassius Clay because I kept telling them I'm going to blow off the factory team, and I got Carol to commit. I said, if I blow off the factory team, I says, I get to drive for the team. Oh, yeah, no problem. So anyhow, my dreams all went up in smoke, and I took off, and I was dead last, and about 30 cars. And it was, I was catching everybody and passing cars, and the announcer was going crazy. Who's this Alan Grant, this bright yellow Cobra, etc. Anyhow, long story short, I ended up finishing second. If the race would have lasted one more lap, I'd have won. But anyhow, what it did, it gave me a chance to showcase my driving. And of course, Shelby was there watching it very attentively, and so and then anyhow, the L.A. Times, I think they had their headlines as they wrote up the story that Alan Grant went through the field like a constipated bull.
Are you proud of that comment?
Yeah, as a matter of fact.
Well, so that's one of your great drives, Lou. Was there a Cobra drive that you are particularly proud of? One that you remember with warmly the way Alan remembers this one?
Every one we finished was one we remembered. I think the most exciting to me was the first time going to Sebring, and I had never raced a car that had that potential and that power. And I went up to Shelby and said, you know, can we have a few laps and kind of get to know the car? And he said, all drivers get 5 laps. By the end of 12 hours, you'll know the car and you'll know the track very well. And that was the end of it.
Now, was that the very race that you were talking about earlier, where you were in the Daytona? Or was
No,
that was an
this
earlier
was 63.
race? Okay, 63.
63, the first team effort at Sebring.
63, the first team effort, and Joan, you know, she was very astute, and so she was going to get us, all the crew, in bib overalls. Instead of going down and get Oshkosh, you know, she had some designer design these bib overalls, and we had red bowling shirts, you know, with a Ford patch on the side, and our name tags were made out with a little puncher deal, you know, where Alan Grant driver, mechanic, et cetera, et cetera. Only problem was with these bib overalls, the first time you bent over, the crotch just split all the way out. So, anyhow, I still have my pair of bib overalls.
Do you really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's
Are they still wide open?
Yes.
Those overalls were not all overalls, they were costumes.
Yes.
They were, a costume designer came in, and you know what a costume designer would have been like. And the guys were a little sensitive about the measurements, especially the inseam, but, yeah, they didn't hold up well.
So, Peter, how did it feel to be part of this team and actually instrumental in making sure that the cars were now capable of competing with Ferrari? Because you were, you know, without your contribution, that wouldn't have happened. So, how did it feel?
Well, it really was just a privilege working with probably the finest group of guys that I've ever been with. And, you know, I designed the exterior of the body, but the real talent that went into that car was the guy that did all the internal structure and put the frame together and stiffened it. And it made all the things like the doors would open and close and the windows wouldn't pop out or anything. I mean,
But that didn't always work. The windows did pop out on occasion.
Not that I remember. I'm talking about the windscreen. We were concerned with, because the Roadsters were so flexible that if we'd used that chassis as is, I mean, the doors would have opened and the glass would have popped out. So stiffening the chassis up and everything. So the transition was so interesting in this era, because this was the last race car really that was built with the collective experience of the fabricators on the shop floor. Their collective racing experience was what made that car as successful as it was. When the GT40 came along, that was a car that was completely engineered on paper, transferred down, and people would make the car. And it took a long time to sort it out. And the thing that made the Daytona successful was that the experience of all the guys that built it, they took as many problems out of that car before it even got a chance to run. So when we first took it out, it was damn fast, even with all the compromises. I was very concerned that the car was going to have some lift at the back end at the speeds we were going to run, and wanted it to put a movable wing on it. This was before the ban came in on movable aerodynamics, and it was a fairly complicated piece to build. And Phil Remington looked at it and he said, you know, we haven't got time to mess around with this idea, and there wasn't a lot of confidence in the eye. So we left it off, and of course the car went out, and already when we ran out and ran it the first time, it was 3.5 seconds a lap faster at Riverside and 20 miles an hour on top speed. So when it got back to the shop, I said, okay, now let's put the wing on it. He said, hey, it ain't broke, let's not fix it, you know. So and so that's the way the car went. It went out pretty much as is, and didn't get changed until Phil Hill drove it at Spa, and at that point we found out that had some real lift problems. And I think there's a photograph that shows up here in the very back end of the car. If we could bring that up, if you could go through this shot. If you look at the back there, the spoiler on that car is made out of 4 little pieces of aluminum. And what happened when we arrived there and Phil drove the car the first few laps, he came in and said, this thing is really evil, you know. I mean, the back end's coming around on me, and at this speed, I'm going to lose the car and crash. And so Phil looked over at the GTOs that had a spoiler on the back end and realized that, you know, we should have had the wing on it, but we didn't. And all we had was a little snap-on top box and one little piece of aluminum. So he cut those pieces of aluminum into 4 pieces, screwed them together, and it was no more stronger than this piece here with a fold on it. And you can see the way it was attached with some screws across the bottom. Well, on the very edges, he put a couple of pieces of welding rod, put a couple of joggles in them so the thing wouldn't fold over in the wind, because otherwise it's like a piece of stiff cardboard. And sent Phil out on the track, and it completely transformed the aerodynamics of the car. Now the car had so much downforce in the rear end that when Phil came in to La Source, which was a real hard braking turn there, he was actually locking the front wheels because the back end was so down and the front end was so light. So he pulled into the pits, explained the situation to Phil, and Phil walked over and drew a line across the back of the spoiler, 1 inch lower than he'd made it, took some tin snips, cut it off, and said, "Try that." You know, and he went out there, and within a couple laps, he'd broken the lap record. He came in, he says, "Don't touch a thing. It's perfect." So that became the magic dimension for the spoilers, and then they were boxed in and built properly. But that was sort of the level of dimension that we did in those days. I mean, literally the conversation between Phil Hill and Phil Remington in a few laps turned that car into a real winner. We compromised at the beginning, left off the things I wanted to do, but Phil fixed the car on the track, and that became the final dimension on the car. That's the spoiler that's on the back end now.
Those of us that were there realized the skill that Remington had.
Absolutely.
And if you look at the Daytona Coupe, right up by the windshield, that's a very complex shape in there. I couldn't even describe it. And they decided, since the car was so hot, that they'd make a little scoop. So Bill walks up and looks at it, takes out a pair of snips, and cuts into the top, and just removed a little piece, I think it was. Then he went off to the side and got a flat piece of aluminum and cut it and pounded on it a bit, took it over and set it down on the top, and it fit perfectly. And then he just, I guess, pop riveted it in place.
The only thing I was explaining to Lou this morning is that Phil didn't understand the aerodynamics of the automobile, because the whole problem was that the cockpit was so hot in the car that he'd made this little flap over the driver's head, and he put this little thing upward, hopefully that he would direct some pressure into the cockpit. He didn't understand that that is the highest airflow over the entire car, so that's the lowest pressure. And what you want to do is you want to suck the air out. So if you just made a hole there, it would have been more effective. But he put this little flap sticking up, which put positive pressure on it, so it really didn't put more air in or suck any out. So if you'll go back and look at that red car here at the end of the talk, you'll see there are 2 extractor vents that I put just behind the windscreen, and those suck the hot air out of the cockpit. So it took me, I don't know, 50 years to get around to doing it on the car, but finally got to do it and proved out perfectly. It worked very well on the car.
Well, this next question is actually going to be for both John and Alan. When you were in your early days of driving for the factory and the roadsters, did you find the same sort of off-the-cuff development work? You're driving, you bring feedback in. Did you find that Remington and the other people would help you make the changes you needed as a driver?
Well, when I drove in '64, the Sebring, and I drove at Elkhart Lake and with Ken and Skip Scott, and then I drove at Bridgehampton. And at the end of '64, the cars were about as good as they were going to get. So there wasn't much development on the roadsters at that point. They'd run, you know, it started in the end of '62, and then they had all of '63. By '64, they were pretty much done, but they were, you know, all of the updates on them, I think, were pretty much Phil. I mean, the first cars were terrible. In fact, he quoted as saying these were just shit boxes when they came. And by the time he was finished with them, they were reliable race cars. The steering used to, fail.
I
That's how
don't
good
think
they were, and
anybody ever gave Remington the credit that he should have had. He was absolutely phenomenal
Yeah.
in the work. He could create anything that needed to be created. He could repair anything that needed to be repaired. And he just looked at it and did it. It's just like it was second nature to him.
I think if
It
you
was-
subtract Phil Remington from the Shelby operation, we wouldn't be here today.
Absolutely.
That is very
Absolutely,
true.
Yeah. The other thing is he was so fast and he was so talented that he'd give a guy a job, something to do, and the guy'd be over there making it, and Phil would look at it for a bit, and finally he'd just walk over there and push the guy out of the way and make it himself.
Yeah, he was a terrible instructor. He just didn't have the patience for
Yeah.
it.
It just drove him nuts to watch people, dithering around, and he was so fast and so good. You just wonder, you just take a bare piece of metal, and within moments he had something that would work. And I mean, to take just a tiny little piece of aluminum and make that piece out of it and transform the car was just amazing.
Before we wind up the question part, I want to ask Alan one more. Now, you had a factory drive that sent you to Europe. So you went to Europe with as part of the Alan Mann Run team. What was it like to be a young American? All of a sudden, you're on an international race team. You're going to all these exotic tracks, and you're really in the running for a championship. What did it feel like to you?
Well, I was the youngest team member, and I went back to work for Carroll. I had to go into the service because I was going to get drafted, and so but I went back to work for Carroll in November of '64, and Carroll had come to me at Laguna Seca at the end of the season and said, "Look, we're going to go to Europe and I'd like to have you go as part of the team." And I said, "Well, I really would like to work on my own car and drive it." And he says, "That's what I had in mind." What he really had in mind, he could get, a driver and a mechanic for $2.75 an hour. And so anyhow, in fact, I went to the airport with John Morton and Earl Jones. In fact, Dave Friedman took a nice picture of the 3 Daytona Coupes that had come back from the Tour de France.
There were four.
Well, actually,
There were
was there
four.
4?
Yeah, one was the one that was a stretch
Okay. yeah.
for the 427.
Anyhow, bottom line is that I was able, as a mechanic, to take that car, bring it into the shop, put it up on jacks, pull it totally apart, go through and rebuild everything and put it back together. And of course, working in the factory, I knew what the horsepower when it came off the dyno was. So I had some advantages there, because I guarantee you that Ed Leslie and I at Daytona and Sebring, we had the strongest engine. And so anyhow, Daytona was my first drive. Keep in mind, I was 23 years old, and I'd raced 12 races in AC Bristol and 4 in a Cobra. And here I was at Daytona. And so obviously, and also took a lot of pictures. In fact, I took a lot of colored slide pictures because I had an Argus C44. And there's a lot of pictures around, but I've got pictures of getting on the airplane, in LA, going through tech at Daytona, going through tech at Sebring, and I'd misplaced these things. I mean, I have boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff, that I'm just now getting to the point, of going through. Anyhow, bottom line, to answer your question, long way around, I was in awe. I mean, I knew and felt history was being made. And to be part of it and to be able to drive on these tracks, that my heroes, had been, it was just amazing. And then to be at Monza and Peter was there, and to drive with Bondurant and to win that race. I mean, it was amazing. Bernard Collier, Shelby, he was good PR. And he had, told everybody, that I was the most promising American driver since Dan Gurney. So anyhow, Bernard Collier, immediately took me out to lunch. And, of course, in Europe, if you're a race car driver, it's like being a rock star in the U.S. And so we enjoyed ourselves quite a bit.
Now, we have a couple more minutes. So is there anything, before we turn to the questions, Lou, you had a really good overview because of your management position. Is there anything you'd like to add about what made the program so successful other than Phil Remington? Was it Shelby's vision? Was it the people in the shop? Was it the drivers? What was it from your overview?
It was everything. It was Shelby's vision. It was Phil Remington's skill. It was Al Dowd that could manage the teams. That could get everybody where they were supposed to be. He was an absolute master at that. Each person that was there had their job. They all did it well. Everybody was thrilled to be doing what they were doing, look forward to it. It just meshed. It just fit.
Don't forget Ford's money.
We can't forget that. Peter,
I'd like to comment on that.
please.
There wasn't a lot of money. Remember that Shelby was the second string team for Ford. The main money was going to Holman and Moody in their stock car program. Ford wasn't really involved pretty much in any part of sports car racing. Shelby made sports car racing be important for Ford Motor Company, and it wasn't until they sidelined the whole Cobra program to bring in the GT40 that the real money came in. But in that first couple of years that we were running, it wasn't a very big budget. It was really the second string outfit, and it was really the collective effort of the guys in there that just had the passion. They were all race car builders and wanted to build the best. That's really what made it. The money came in later in lots of it, but it was after the Cobra program. The Cobra program is the thing that convinced Ford Motor Company to get really involved in racing.
You had to be there to see it and get the feeling. You could never understand the way that it got put together and the esprit de corps that everyone had to get the job accomplished. It was just unbelievable.
Well, it was a tiny operation, wasn't it?
Very small. At the beginning, I mean, we were like, well, the first time they went over there, we had 8 guys at Spa, I think. There were 12 mechanics. We didn't even have enough guys in the shop to build the next 5 Daytona Coupes. They had to send them over to Italy, and they were built at Carrozzeria Grand Sport in Modena. And they charged us $3,500 a piece for those bodies completely painted.
Wow. How could you afford it?
Is that the price for the bodies of your new cars?
Just incredible. I mean, that's a whole different thing to talk about. But the chance again to work with another group of guys in Italy to build those cars. I worked in a couple of different shops there in Modena with the Medardo Fantuzzi, later in Di Tommaso, and then of course with Carrozzeria Grand Sport doing the coupes. But can you imagine that entire car? The thing would come in as a basic chassis, and they'd build that car for $3,500, and believe me, they had tools that came out of the dark ages. I mean, they didn't have anything, and to see them create those cars was
Hammers and sandbags?
yeah, not even, well, I don't even remember seeing a good sandbag. We used a tree stump that was kind of hollowed out and soft in the middle, and they'd pound it out in that soft part of the tree stump and then take it over to a planishing table about 18 inches square and take a big flat hammer and knock all the walnuts out of it and piece it together like a quilt. And then they'd weld all these pieces together, and they had the young apprentices, the guys that were welding this aluminum together. And these guys were welding this stuff without goggles. And I walked over and said, hey, you can't weld this without goggles. You're going to ruin your eyes. And they said, oh, only the masters can wear the goggles. That's how poor these guys were. Yeah. And, I wanted to go back to the United States because we had all the Trick Airline torches and Birtwell goggles and Trick Aviade snips and everything. And, God, if I could have done anything, it would have been just to buy them the tools. But they built those cars that way. It was an amazing experience.
Well, that wraps up this portion of our seminar. Please give everyone a great round of applause. We are very, very lucky to have all of these people assembled here. So now is your opportunity. If you have any questions about the racing program, please go ahead. Wait for the mic, please.
Gentlemen, this has been very interesting. One name I haven't heard anything mentioned. Can you tell us anything about Ken Miles?
There isn't enough time to tell you anything about Ken Miles. Ken Miles was a true Englishman. His family was in the tea business. He drank tea all the time. They always called him Teddy Teabagger. And at the airport, I shared an office with him, and he'd bring in the hot water and have tea, open up the window, and he always dumped the tea out, the remainder out on the pavement. And I guess probably to this day, there was a stain underneath that window where he poured his tea.
Yeah.
He was, I don't even know how to describe the man. He was so amazing in everything that, you know, that he did.
Why don't you talk to the development work he did on the early Cobras? Because he was probably working very closely with Remington on that, wasn't he? On the development?
Yeah, you probably know better than that. Than
Well, I'd say at the beginning there was some friction in there because Ken spoke in a very educated, clipped English accent. He was self-educated, very bright, and a lot of the guys didn't really appreciate. They thought he was kind of putting on airs, and it wasn't until they really decided later that the talent that he had really brought him about, because he didn't become the hero right away. A lot of people sort of resented him because he wasn't sort of a California team guy.
No.
But then after they saw him drive and the talent that was there, the respect was just incredible. And the longer he drove, the better it got. But he was very outspoken. He'd argue with anything about anybody if he felt about it. And there were a lot of friction sometimes on that. He didn't suffer fools lightly. He'd tell you exactly what he thought, and that made some problems. But boy, did he command the respect at the end. I'll tell you, he was one of the greats.
John, he must have been something of a mentor to you, because he's the one who got you your drive, isn't he?
I think more than anybody else, I think he was instrumental in making that happen. And I've thought about it through the years, and more recently, I think I owe him more than I thought I did back then. When I bought my first race car, as I worked there, was a Lotus Super 7, and he came up to me one day and he said, "Put this cam in your car. Put this cam in your car. It'll help. We'll make it go faster." And I did, and it did go faster. But he, I think he did. I like to think he mentored me. I drove with him twice in the 3 races that I drove for Shelby. We won at Elkhart Lake thanks to him. I started the race. Skip Scott drove second. We each had to drive about 180 miles. And then Ken's car had broken earlier. It was a 3-car team, and they put him in our car at the end, and we won the race. We were second overall, so that was a big high for me in my second year of racing. One of the races that I'll never forget. Well, I'll have quite a few I'll never forget, but that was the first one I'll never forget.
I also say that Daytona Coupe would not have gotten built without Ken Miles. He was the guy that was really the champion for the idea within the company, because there was so much resistance to the idea of building a car in that form. But Ken had built a couple of his own specials that were very unconventional in Southern California and had been very successful with them. So he had a very open mind about new ideas, and he also, being English, had known something of the history of what the Germans had been doing in the late 30s. So he was open to the idea, and I think that it was he that finally convinced Shelby that the ideal was worth continuing with. And if it hadn't have been for Ken, of course, it wouldn't have happened. So, and then of course when he got in the car the first time and drove it, and it was so fast that it really made the whole program go. So we owe Ken a lot.
That was an absolutely fantastic question. Thank you.
Everybody thought Ken was a snob,
Yeah.
and he really was not. But in the war, he got shot up. He was in the tank corps in Africa. He told stories about going out at night to repair a tank to try to get it back, and the German tanks were out there, and he could hear the Germans talking and working on their tanks, and everyone ignored the other one. But he in being shot up, had lost hearing in one ear, and didn't hear very often what you said, and people just thought they were being ignored, and that really was not Ken at all.
Yeah.
Very, very open, loads of fun, absolutely amazing person.
Absolutely, yeah.
No, I understand.
Yeah, he almost cost me my hearing too. We were at Daytona, and the team, we had these cherry bombs, and so all of a sudden, we'd checked into the hotel, and we were just getting cleaned up, and all of a sudden get a rap on the door, and open the door, and here Miles throws in this cherry bomb. It went off about right here, but again, he had this kind of his typical, what I call British superiority complex. We're just the colonists over here. That's kind of the way he made you feel. But you've heard the rest of the story, and he was an incredible man and an incredible driver.
Are you sure that wasn't Dowd that threw in the cherry bomb?
No, it was Ken Miles.
Now, he took fitness pretty seriously long before drivers really focused on that, didn't he?
When I went to the races I raced at Watkins Glen as well in my own car, but Shelby entered at Lotus 23, and Miles would run every morning, and he'd ask Ed Leslie, "You want to run in the morning?" Are you crazy? And Bob Johnson, and he asked me. Of course, I would have followed him into hell. I said, "Okay." So about 5 in the morning, there's a knock on the door, "Wakey, wakey," and I get up and we run through the woods in New York and then down in Daytona, and he had an incredible stamina. He was the oldest person on the team, I think, and he could drive 2 races. He'd drive the Cobra in the GT race, and then in an hour and a half or so, they'd run the prototype race, and he'd run the same car, and that was 180 miles. So he'd run 280 miles all by himself. And after Watkins Glen, I was in my Lotus, and I had just run the big race, the long race, and he had run both of them. And I was so tired at the end. I'm 22 years old. And I said, "Aren't you tired?" And I was totally wilted. He said, "No, not really." He's 46 years old.
He loved cats, and he got a message one day that Pedro was arriving at the airport, and it gave a time, and I think a flight, I'm not sure. And he couldn't figure what it was, and finally decided it had to be Pedro Rodriguez that was coming in from Mexico. And so he went out, and he got there, no Pedro Rodriguez. Finally a crate came out, and there was a cat in it, and that was Pedro. And he opened up the cage, and this monster came out and just about clawed him to death. So he put it back in the cage, and he took it home, and he worked with it. And it was Tom Payne, I think it was, pulled the trick on him.
Yeah.
And Tom was coming in for a race, and Ken went out to the airport and met him, and he had Pedro drooped around his neck, just as calm as could be.
Oh, that's
Never
wonderful.
said a word.
Yeah.
Didn't need to.
Great story. That's wonderful.
We have another question?
Never heard that.
I just wanted to ask real quick, what was the team sentiment after the 1966 Le Mans race, the finish, and what did Ken feel after that? Because it's kind of a sad deal, I think, in the whole Shelby American team history, and I just wanted to get your opinion on that, how the team felt.
Well, you're talking about the staged finish where he lost the victory because they all had to line up in the car. He hadn't done as much distance.
Correct.
Very, very hard to tell on that because nobody wants to take the real decision on who made that happen, and whether it was Ford Motor Company or whether it was Carroll or whatever happened. And each of the guys had his own idea. I've heard that story 4 or 5 different ways, but whatever it was sure unfair.
I saw him at Watkins Glen in '66, and I asked him about it, and he was still upset. I don't remember how long it would have been after, not very long, and he died not long after that. But I think he took some hard feelings to his grave.
He was very bitter. As I said, we had been good friends in office together and so on. He came back from that, was walking into the plant as I was going out. I said, "Hi, Ken." It's like, he was just absolutely
yeah.
bitter.
Yeah.
Just terrible. Hated to see it happen, because it shouldn't have happened to Ken Miles of all the people that were there.
A thing that happened earlier, exactly in the same vein, is understand that the Daytona Coupe was built because of Ken. He was the champion within the company. The car was really built around him like a tailored suit. Whole car was done. It never would have gotten done without Ken. And then before we took it to Daytona, Carroll took him out of the cockpit, wouldn't let him drive the car. And it was his car. I mean, it was custom fit to him. Nobody else cared much about it, but Carroll pulled him out of the car. And never really explained why. There was a little press release said, "Oh, Ken's too valuable to us as a test driver. We can't put him in a race car." And it was a real blow to Ken. I mean, he was angry and bitter at that. Again, it was the same thing. Is that there was one major ego at Shelby American, and anybody that got too close to that, I think, got set down.
You have personal experience, huh?
Yeah.
Well, with that opening, maybe we need to hear a little bit about that personal experience. Was there one incident in particular, Pete?
It's just the way things were, and if you didn't like it, you could have left. So, why complain about it?
We have a question over by Corey.
Shelby was quite critical of the Coupe early on, sometimes with four-letter words.
Yes.
How did he come around? Obviously, nothing succeeds like success.
He never did.
He never did.
He never did. It's very strange. The car was built, and it was interesting. He had a very, very good friend and another Texan, a guy named Benny Howard, who was a very famous aerodynamicist, had designed the Howard racers that won the Thompson Trophy and the Bendix Trophy in the late 30s. I mean, this guy was a top aerodynamicist. And so he brought Benny down to the shop. We were about 80% complete with the car, and showed him the car. And he'd finally gotten sort of into thinking the car was going to be pretty good, and brought Benny down and asked him his opinion on it. And I'm pretty impressed. I'd heard about Benny Howard. And so I tried to explain what the theories were that the Germans had come up with for the car, and Howard said, that'll never work. He said, that's not going to work. And he says, what's the frontal area of the car? And I gave him to it, and he did some figures in his head. He says, you're going to need at least 600 horsepower to make that car go fast, He said, this thing needs, a long tail on it, and so when the car was finally successful, I guess he went back to Howard and said, well, hey, how come the car is so good? Howard said, if it had been done this way, it would have been faster. And to this day, to the very end, Carroll always thought that the car was wrong, and it wasn't that good.
But that didn't stop him from wanting a little something when you were doing your coupe.
Oh, yeah, but that's a whole nother story.
We have another question.
Hi, I'm Nick Acton. I did have a question. There was an awful lot of hype about 427s, and they're the predominant thing on the market these days. The 289s you guys drove with the leaf springs, allowing the uprights to move and that type of thing. From the driver's perspective, did you guys get to try both cars, and have you any comments on that?
I never really drove a 427 in competition, but referring back to Ken Miles did. And he was under the opinion that had you put a 289 in a 427 chassis, it would have been the ultimate. The 289 is so responsive, and but then the 427 so heavy that he thought that would have been the perfect car.
We had a question from Dave on the front row.
Can any of you comment on the story about Dean Moon being involved at his shop with the first Cobra or AC Bristol conversion?
Peter?
Yeah, I worked down there at Dean Moon's shop at the very beginning, being his first paid employee. Joan Cole was the first employee with Shelby. But we had a little corner of Dean Moon's shop down there, and we really started off when Carroll came back and got the Goodyear had given him the distributorship for Goodyear tires. And so we had sort of a little warehouse in there with the very first T3 tires in there, and that was really what Dean had done setting him up. But the very first Cobras weren't built out there. It's actually built with Ed Hughes back in Pennsylvania. And we never saw that car, and you'll see that car here this weekend. It belongs now to Bruce Myers. 001 was never built at Shelby American. It was built with Ed Hughes back in Pennsylvania, and then it was sold to Lucky Kasner, who took it to Europe, and then it raced all sort of club racing all over Europe, and then ended up in Morocco, North Africa. And the original owner from France, when the prices started going up, went back down to Morocco, bought the car back, fudged the serial numbers back on it to get it back into France, and ended up selling it to Bruce. So that's really the way it came about. And until we moved over to Lance Revenel's place over in Venice and got Phil Remington and some of the rest of the crew on that built those cars up, there wasn't much of a Shelby operation. Phil is the guy that really made it go.
Yes, hi, Peter. Larry from Colorado. On one of your TV shows about a year and a half ago, you talked about the Daytona Coupe that came back from Bonneville, had set a record, and then sat at the back end of the shop, and the old man says, "Get the hell out of here."
Right.
And what it sold for?
Yeah. He offered it to anybody in the shop. That, hey, do any of you guys want the car? You know, I mean, it had come off the Cobra tour, the Total Performance tour. It was a show car. They put it on tour, and what had happened at Bonneville, there was a big contest going on for the land speed record, with Craig Breedlove up there, and it was a contest between Firestone and Goodyear, and the rules were that if one competitor was holding the salt to run, the next one couldn't get on and use the salt till they were done. And Breedlove was having problems with his car and didn't want the opposing team to get on there with the Firestones. So they called down to Shelby and said, "Hey, can you send a car up here and we'll pretend to set some records with the car." So they literally pulled his show car off, put a brand new engine in it, put the biggest tires they could on the back end, and sent it up there with Tom Greaterix by himself. And he towed the car to Bonneville. And when they arrived up there, I mean, even Craig didn't even know what the 4-speed pattern was in the car. They had to show him what it was, how to drive it. And they ended up setting 23 world records with the car up there. You know, right, just right off the showroom floor, so to speak. But it was so destroyed running on the salt for 12 hours there, because the salt wasn't very good that year, and it got big ridges in it, and it was crashing around there around that 12-mile circle, that by the time it got back, you know, the windows were broken out of it, the headlight buckets were falling out. It was just completely encrusted with salt. And it came back, you know, after being at this show car that we'd had on the Total Performance tour. And Carroll offered it to anybody in the shop $800, and everybody turned it down. So they rebuilt it back up and sold it to a slot car manufacturer, and he drove it on the street for a couple of years.
And then it eventually sold for $4 million to a doctor in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
It's in the Simeon Museum, Simeon Foundation Museum in Philadelphia. Do we have any other questions on the floor? That gentleman over here. Would you wait for the mic, please?
Could you tell us about Dave McDonald?
Boy, I think maybe John, I think you can say something on that.
Yeah, I've been kind of doing something, writing some stuff about him, and I don't know if I can get through it very well, but I was on a truck going to Moseport with my Lotus 23, and in the back of the truck was Dave's car, the Cooper, and the other car was for Ken, a Cobra Roadster, and we were listening to the Indy 500, and we were really proud that he was going to be in it, and you know, what happened. And I think it had an impact on the whole team, maybe forever, I don't know, because the stars of the Cobra team were really McDonald and Miles. And I know he was my hero. They all were, but he especially, because he worked in the shop. He wasn't a rich guy, he was just a kid that worked in a Chevy dealership, and then was a really good Corvette driver. I think his first racing was drag racing, did some drag racing, but he was so good. He just had something that hardly anybody has. I always, still to this day, wish I'd had it. But anyway, that's all I got to say.
I was at the Venice shop. It was on a Saturday morning. For some reason, was upstairs in Shelby's office sitting there, and Davey walked in. And that's when he had just come back from practice at Indy. And he said, "I don't like this car." He said, "There are problems with it. It doesn't handle." And kept describing it, and Shelby said, "Get out of the car."
Yeah.
And he said, "Well, I can't." And he said, "Get out of the car." He didn't. You know the result.
Yeah. Jim Clark said, I guess followed him on Carburation Day, I think it was, which was, I think it's Thursday, before the race when the car's already qualified, and he followed him, and he said, I mean, this is a well-known quote. He said, "Get out of the car, mate. Just walk away." And of course, Dave couldn't do that, and then he crashed on the second lap, driving like he normally would drive as fast as he could go. I think he maybe told himself he was going to take it easy because he didn't like the car, but he didn't know how to do that.
He always drove with the rear end hanging out. I think since that car was so loose that he felt a little more comfort than he should have.
I first saw Dave drive at Stockton in a Corvette, and I'd never in my life seen anything like it. He was incredibly talented. I had the good fortune of going to the Dodger Stadium race, Ken Miles, and we ran two cars. And Davey drove one, and Ken Miles drove the other. And to see him drive that car, I mean, literally sideways, is just phenomenal. But also, Davey was committed, on the 289s. He would actually come in, and he would take the transverse leaf springs apart and actually polish them, and then put grease in them, so that they would actually be more flexible. And that's the type of thing that Davey did, and he worked at it, and he was good.
We have another question in the back.
Yeah, just thank you guys. It's just amazing to be in your presence. But just a question on development in cars. As the Cobra team went through their variations and changes and updates, what's your perspective, both maybe Carol's as well as yours, of the Chaparral, John Hall, another Texan, of his development of his cars?
Well, I can answer part of that, having worked at GM at the same period that was going on. Jim was brilliant, obviously Caltech grad, and had a lot of great ideas, but a lot of that car came out of GM as well. And it was the perfect cover for them to do that development, and the Rattlesnake Raceway was plugged in all the way around, so they could monitor his speeds on every part of the track. So whatever changes that he came up with, or whatever ideas that GM came up with, that was really the first real development that was done on a race car. And I think that the fact that they could test that on his own racetrack and out in the middle of nowhere where nobody could see what was going on was really the secret to what Jim Hall contributed to racing. Very much like Penske, and very methodical in what he did, and with the backing of GM, to have all of that electronics really made some changes in racing. And all the innovation, everything that he did, the wing and the transmission, the composite chassis, just fabulous. Jim Hall was really one of the greats.
Do we have another question, or is that pretty much it? Oh, we have one in the back.
Done a lot of reading and always hear about the teams at the different tracks, but I was always curious. John, you mentioned going in a Carmen Ghia from LA to Sebring. I was wondering how the rest of the team got there. Did they fly? Did they drive? I know on the West Coast, the Cobra team would sometimes come through Oregon on their way to Kent, Washington, and that was always a big draw, but I was always curious about the rest of the team, the mechanics, the drivers. How did they go from one track to another?
They flew.
Yeah, they flew.
Actually, we flew, and again, that's part of the things that I recorded the history of, and I still have all my airline tickets and stubs and everything as we flew.
You're going to put them on eBay?
Yeah.
Now, there still couldn't have been a lot of budget. Were you rooming together and cutting costs? And
Who's that?
Actually, no, we'd actually have like two guys to a room.
now, wasn't there, particularly in Europe, wasn't there a hierarchy that the drivers would stay in one level of accommodation and the mechanics in another? I think I noticed this in reading the Schoen book.
I was not aware of it. When we were there, we pretty much, like we went to Monza, Charlie Agapoo and Gordon Chance and I, and we all stayed the same places. I'm sure Shelby and, the Ford people, but I wasn't aware of any.
Yeah, when Ford came in, there was a whole hierarchy of
Yeah.
the suits that stayed in a different place than the team did. But I'd say the team was pretty democratic on every place they went together.
Team like being together.
Except John, of course, and Coupe and Schofield, they had to drive the Carmagia.
I rode in the truck a couple times.
Yeah.
One of the things we haven't talked about that I think is important that we point out, that that first Daytona Coupe, that Bondurant and Gurney at Le Mans in '64, they led that race overall. And had it not been for, I think it was an oil leak or something, that they would have won the thing, in its literally the first year out. Just think about that. A car built in 90 days. And then, of course, the big thing is that, when I went to Europe, Peter was over there at Radford, working on the 427 Coupe. And of course, all of a sudden, mysteriously, the funding got pulled from that. Well, think about it. Here's Ford. What would they think? I mean, here you'd put a 427 in the new Coupe. I mean, I'm convinced in my own mind it would have won Le Mans '65. What do you think, Pete?
If it had been done right, the plan was that the car was supposed to be built down at Carrozzeria Grand Sport like the other coupes were, and I think Ford wanted the car not to be built, so they ended up having it built in England, where it turned out to be just a complete disaster. But that was sort of the way it was cut underneath politically, and it never was done right. It ended up pretty awful.
What happened to that pretty awful car?
It came back. It was called a Super Slug, and sat in the back of the shop, and eventually sold off at the fire sale. And it's still circulating around the collector market. Interestingly enough, it got built back up again, and it actually was pretty quick, even in spite of all of the things that were done wrong with it. It was fairly fast, but it was badly done. And again, it's one of those things you'd like to go back and try to fix it up, but maybe that'll happen someday.
Break your heart. When the cars came back from Europe, I had to sell them, and we wanted $5,000 a piece for them. And I went around begging people to give us $5,000 for the Cobras, including Daytona Coupes.
Yeah.
I wish I'd have kept one.
Yeah.
We have a question. Someone at the mic there, yeah?
John, you talked about your drive out east in the Carmanguia, but as I recall, your drive back to Shelby after the race was a little more adventurous. You want to tell that story?
Well, I'd gotten secretly married to stay out of the Army. It's a long story. I wasn't exactly a draft dodger because Vietnam wasn't very hot at the time. So my parents found out I was secretly married, and they took my wife to Sebring, because when they found out I was going to be there. So I went back. I flew back because I spent a week with her in Savannah, and that's why I have a daughter who's 47 years old. But Jeffrey and John Coupe drove. They left the next afternoon after the race, and Jeffrey was going to have to drive the whole way because of Coupe's problem. And he drove as far, I think he said he got into Mississippi, and he was so tired that he said to ask Coupe if he'd just drive a short period and spell him. So Coupe said, yeah, sure, no problem. So Jeffrey got in the back and tried to stretch out in such a way that he could go to sleep, and he finally did. And he said most of that was it was a narrow road with a bunch of semis coming the other way, both ways. So Jeffrey woke up to a loud crashing sound. The car spun around and ended up on the side of the road. They had head-oned another Carmen Ghia. It may be the only two Carmen Ghias in Mississippi. It was kind of a side swipe head-on, so the car wasn't destroyed, but it was hurt enough, and they didn't have any money, so they messed around and got it into shape enough that they could continue the trip. And when I got back to California about a week later, here's this Carmen Ghia that we'd ridden, and it was black with a white top, and it's just the whole side's taped up with Visqueen. And I asked Jeffrey, I went in the shop and said, what the hell happened to you guys? And he told me that story. So, you know, be careful when you're driving late at night and you get tired, you just pull over.
Did we have any other questions, or should we wrap up? Well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank these gentlemen for joining us. We're hearing stories, some of which haven't been told in years, maybe a few things that haven't been told at all. Please give them a big round and thank them for joining us.